Good evening. My name is Sabrina Bowers McCoy, and I am happy to be here presenting at the 45th Afro-American Historical and Genealogical Society's annual conference. My topic this evening is Ancestral Odessey, authoring and publishing family histories. The power of genealogy and storytelling is a specific topic that I'd like to discuss. Just to give you a little background on myself, I have written 8 books. I consider myself to be an amateur genealogist, and the 8 books I've mentioned before, they were all centered around capturing my family's histories and documenting that throughout American history. So that's a little bit about who I am. Let's go take a look at tonight's agenda. So let's discuss tonight's agenda. We'll start with the conference theme, fighting erasure. What does that mean? Followed by self-erasure, exploring our ancestral roots, chronicling our family histories, crafting creative nonfiction novels, the impact of family histories. I'll end it with giving you tips on how to get started, and then it'll be followed by Q&A. Let's get started. When I learned of this year's conference theme, I decided to go look it up. Let me read to you what it says. Cultural erasure is the systematic destruction or gradual removal of a group's culture. It can be caused by oppression, assimilation, or modernization. Cultural erasure can lead to the loss of a group's history, their language, and their traditions. It can affect the identity and sense of belonging of the members of the group. Once I listened and understood what that definition meant, I thought how appropriate it is the work that we are doing now. And I want to encourage you to be steadfast in aggregating and collecting all of your family's histories before this information is lost to time. Cultural erasure is not a new thing. It has happened in the past, and currently there are bills that are being proposed to remove certain words out of history books and historical documents. So I just want to just encourage you and then applaud you for the work that you're doing now to be able to capture your family's histories. In addition to this systematic removal of one's culture, I want to also talk about self-erasure. I bring up that because while I was chronicling my family's histories, I traveled through 4 different states and I interviewed nearly 100 of my elders. And I asked questions of them. Questions like, do you know where your great-grandfather worked? Or do you know where your grandmother's grandmother lived? And I kept hearing over and over, I don't know that. We don't, we never asked those questions. And we never heard any of the stories because kids knew to stay in a kid's place. And when grown folks came over, we knew to get up and leave the room. And so not having the ability to sit down with their elders and have conversations, not able to be in the room and hear certain stories has led to this lack of transparency. And throughout history and time, family facts have been lost. And so those gaps have led to this self-erasure. We only go back so many generations where we have, we're lost. That information has been lost in time. And so I want to just say, while you're chronicling your family's histories, make sure that you are taking what you know. And if you choose to publish a book, make sure that you are capturing that information, preserving it in something like a book or a novel. And then generations after you won't have to go through the lengths that you had to find and reconnect to your roots. They'll have that information that you provided for them in that book. And then that information is now passed down to the next generation. Exploring ancestral roots. Let me just say, I think this slide, it's the start of it all. It's where the journey begins. If I could say it in terms of like a movie, the protagonist embarks on a journey because of an inciting incident. This would be that for your genealogical journey. For me, I would watch shows like Finding Your Roots or Who Do You Think You Are? And I watched as these celebrities reconnected to their roots and learned different facts about certain family members. I laughed with them, I cried with them. But at the end of the episode, I would sit and tell myself, I want that for me. I want to be able to collect that information and give it to other family members so now they know from whence they came. And so my inciting incident was sending a sample to 23andMe and African Ancestry. For 23andMe, I wanted to know all of the ethnicities that make up my DNA. But for African Ancestry, obviously, I wanted to know my ancestors, what tribes they were directly connected to. And so I sent out both of those samples to those two entities. And while I was waiting on that, I tapped into, different platforms that could provide information for me. And Ancestry as well as Family Search, I was able to get birth certificates, death certificates, marriage license, find out what schools they went to, who they married, the names of their children, where they worked, that and more. I mean, I even found a Freedmen's Bureau bank record, how much money they had in the account and how they wanted it to be dispersed. That was more information that I was able to, go further down the journey and learn more about family members that might have been listed on that Freedmen's Bureau bank record. And so there are other platforms. Those are platforms that you'd have to pay for. But the Library of Congress can provide some of those same documents, possibly even more information free of charge. And then there are your local and your state libraries. Don't underestimate the information that you can find in your local cities. And I'd even say there was one particular fact that I wanted to chase down. And I went to a local library, and that librarian contacted her grandmother, who knew about this story about my family member that I needed to know more about. She lived in that town her whole life, and she knew the story. So not only was I able to find some document, but I was able to get another oral story on the family member from a non-family member. So these are sources that you can use. And my last bullet is interviewing. Now I have it as the last bullet, but in terms of priority, I would say, make it at the top. It's number one. Never underestimate the information that can be collected and gathered from oral interviewing. But I would say you have to be present and ask the questions. There may be some information that they know, but they've never sat down with one of their descendants or, their juniors to just share that information. I mentioned in an earlier slide, I had interviewed over 100 family members, and I had family members that were 99 years old, 101 years old, as young as 60 years old, but all of them had information that they were ready to share. Tonight I'll be sharing with you actual pages from my family history book. So I'm requesting no audio or video recording and no images taken. So now that we've discussed the type of documents you could find from various platforms, let's move forward with how do we craft a story? How do we write a book, a family history book? For me, I think the easiest way into that was to start with the census documents. They tell us where a family member was born, where they currently live, and the members of their family. And because census documents or the census is done every 10 years, you can see if they remained in that area, or in my family's case, they began to migrate. One of my earliest documented ancestors, they were born in Virginia, they lived in Mississippi, and ultimately they ended up settling in Arkansas. All of that was told to me through the various 10-year census documents. So they gave me a lot of material that I could focus my writing on. And then one of my ancestors, we never knew her surname. We never knew her last name. All we knew was Cherry. And it wasn't until I pulled one of those documents from Ancestry.com that I was able to see through her application to get her child a Social Security number. I saw her last name, Gulledge. Cherry Gulledge. It was the first time we were able to ever say that out loud in generations. That's one of the things that had been lost to time. And then Gulledge, I thought, okay, let's trace that. Let's figure out what, where and that came into play. And so I traced Cherry back to a Mississippi farm with the family Gulledge. And ultimately, a Gulledge, Cherry's enslaver. She married a man whose surname was Foote. That's how her husband came into play. My 3 times great grandfather, Washington Foote. He apparently had been enslaved, or allegedly had been enslaved, by a Virginia Foote who brought him to Mississippi, and a Foote man married a Gulledge woman, and their property moved with them. And so that's how, when they migrated to Arkansas, that's how my ancestors ended up in Arkansas. As I delved deeper and deeper in exploring my ancestral roots, I ran into a document that was a labor contract, one of those documents that I got off of one of the sources that I mentioned in a previous slide. And this was a curious document for me because it was right after the Civil War. My ancestors were freedmen now. They had been emancipated. Yet the labor contract stated that they could not leave the land that they were sharecropping. And then there were all of these conditions for, the work that they had to do, that if they failed to give true and faithful service, that they could be reported to the Freedmen's Bureau. And under the terms and conditions of it, they could forfeit a portion of their salaries due, which they didn't get that to the end of the year, or they could forfeit all of the money depending on if they, weren't meeting the quota, or was late or absent to work. I mean, these were penalties that were inflicted on them during the Black Codes era that could lead to them being jailed. And then they would be wards of the state, and they would have to offer those same services for free. I brought these 2 pages into tonight's conversation because I wanted to show the diversity in my family line. I wanted to bring in the South Carolina aspect of my lineage, because in South Carolina, the cash crop was rice. I mean, they had indigo, tobacco, and cotton for sure, but this was an opportunity for me to talk about a different crop other than tobacco in Virginia and the Mississippi cotton. This was rice and indigo were 2 of the major crops that were grown in South Carolina. And so I have the Peoples family, Kellys, and the Scarboroughs that all were, enslaved in South Carolina. So I wanted to talk about that in the history book. This gave me another layer of information to discuss, not just about rice as a crop and South Carolina as a state, but those potential African tribes that we may have come from, because a lot of the slaves that were purchased in South Carolina were from Sierra Leone and other peoples that were rice growers. So this was just another layer that I could discuss within the history book. This contract specifically states that they would get 1/5 of the corn and cotton and wheat and oats that they raised after payment of their rent and whatever those terms and conditions were. And I guess I just wanted to show this to show you what they did to survive. That kind of information, for me at least, helps me know the grit that I come from. It helps me to take a sense of pride that they did what was necessary to house and feed their family. Were the conditions fair? No, absolutely not. And this ended up becoming um, another way of enslaving them. A lot of times during this era, they ended up owing rather than getting paid at the end of their contract year. And so that would force them to be sharecroppers another year. But what could they do? They were emancipated. They had no land. They had no property. They had no means of supporting their families. They were just formerly enslaved people released into a hostile land. And so here are the things that they had to do in order to, be able to shelter and feed their families. And for me, I take pride in knowing that. And that's why this document was so important to me to find. And then that ended up being added to the family history book. As I began developing the pages in my family history book, I wanted a visual of the information that typically we would find in that white family Bible, where it would be a family member's name, who was the head of the household, who they married, and then a list of their children. So at the top of this page, you see a graphic that kind of displays that. And then I took each one of the children and put mini bios on them. So when were they born? When did they die? At least the year. And then who did they marry and what were their children's names? There were some family members that, I couldn't find any information on, but we knew based on a census document that they were one of the children. So I would put their name and then I would say, I do not have any information on that family member, but at least their name is in the book. All those that I knew. I didn't want their name to be forgotten. And on the next page, it is one of our family members that was the last documented lynching in Pine Bluff, Arkansas. It was in the year of 1892. So I didn't want our family members to forget about this family member. Many of them didn't know we were even related to this person that was lynched in Pine Bluff. And I will say that he was the last known documented lynching. However, in our family, we did experience another after him during well, not the civil rights era, but right during Jim Crow era and on the heels of civil rights. This image is a center spread in one of my history books, We Are Malele Volume 1. It represents the culmination of all of the historical information in terms of ethnic background that I found on all 5 of my surnames. I'm an artist, and so I love visual imagery. I love this colorful imagery that this poster shows. All my family members, they have this matted and framed and hanging on the walls, those that got a copy of it. So I know that we've already began talking about chronicling family histories, but I put this topic on this slide because I want to talk about some of the other artifacts that you can get that can help chronicle the family history. We've already talked about getting from Ancestry documents like birth certificates and marriage license and death certificates, but I don't want you to underestimate the information and the documents that you can find when you visit family members. I know in my search and in my interviewing with family members, I was able to get photographs. I was able to get artifacts. One particular artifact, it was a ledger book. And in that ledger book, it showed how much cotton had grown that harvest season and how much cotton seeds were remaining and the dollar value associated with those seeds. That kind of information I wouldn't have thought to even ask for. She just, my family member just got up and went and got the book, and she allowed me to take this precious artifact that was frail. The pages were frail, but she knew the assignment that I had. Family members will know what the work you're doing, and they're ready for our stories to be heard and to be told. And so I would say, don't underestimate those things that you could find at family members' houses. If they don't have it, they can tell you who does. And incorporate that into your storylines, incorporate that into your history books because it helps chronicle the family history. Keep it going, and these facts, these artifacts can help explain and tell the who, what, when, where, and why our family members do the things that they do. So don't underestimate the gems that can be found at your family members' homes. These are some of those photographs that I mentioned on the previous slide that I collected from some of the family members while I was visiting them. Some of them let me take pictures of pictures, and some of them let me bring them back with me and get them, scanned in. So to me, this was precious to be able to find, I think these were called convex portraits. These are those pictures that have kind of like the bubble frame around it or the bubbled glass. Um, and I thought that this was priceless to get these type of photographs. I just wanted to show, how I displayed it in my history book. I wanted to share these two pages because I wanted to show you how I took that information and began writing the life story of a specific family member. So here I talked about their early life, their education levels, who they married. If I had found a marriage certificate from one of the platforms I mentioned earlier, I would embed that license in this area. I talked about the children that came out of that marriage, where they lived, where they worked. I simply wanted to show you a template that you could go by if you chose to do a history book, and then how you take those facts and that information and build it into a storyline like this. I mentioned that I had traveled through 4 states. This was one of the states where I went and visited graveyards and took pictures of tombstones. So I just wanted to show that. I am sharing these 2 pages out of my history book for 2 reasons. One, in the upper left-hand corner is a picture of that ledger that I have spoken about. But more importantly, these 2 pages have a lot of the notes that I had gathered during my interviews with family members. They recalled instances of this specific family member that I was talking about, whether it was what their favorite food was, what the type of clothes they wore, their temperament, what was their personality like, or just a specific story that they wanted to share. All of that was captured in each section on each family member, our matriarchs and patriarchs of our family. And so I wanted to just share with you kind of that information that I had collected and gathered based on the interview questions that I asked them. This is just a mosaic of various pictures of my family members that, you know, are proudly holding their copy of our family history book. This was the first time I ever put them all together into one picture. And I will tell you that it was emotional for me to aggregate them all and put them on this slide. I can't tell you what it means to me to see them hold their books with such pride and all of the conversations and the stories that have been shared at family events since they've had copies of this family book. So know that the work that you're doing, it won't be in vain. It will be received by your family members as a treasured gift, whether you choose to do a history book or a novel, just to have it documented. Our family members lived, they mattered, they had a personality. They were not just Negro girl 13 or Negro boy 9. They were our family members and they had a name. And so know that the work that you're doing, it's important work. And you will see in dividends, you will see the return on your work. After I finished the history book, I had a lot of friends asking me where could they purchase it. And for me, it was a private collection. It was meant to be a private collection. And so I thought I've got to do something to get something out commercially. And the answer for me was writing The Cedar Chest. This is a nonfiction that centers around the life and legacy of Cherry Foote. I wanted to make sure that I had created a character to focus on. She is the protagonist in the book. You know, your story could be you have a protagonist, an anti-hero, a hero, or an ensemble of individuals that the reader will be focusing on. Just make sure you create these compelling stories that center around the facts that you've collected from those different platforms mentioned earlier. Um, in the course of writing the book, I wanted these chapter headings, the visuals of it. So I asked family members if they would pose as an aged progression of Cherry. And so my mother, my sister's daughter, and her daughter played Cherry at the ages of 5, 25, 55, and 75. And those are the images that you see at the top of the screen. I just wanted to point out one other thing. Where's your storyline going? Where is the focus of it? For me, I chose Cherry as one of Arkansas's interviewees from the WPA project Slave Narratives. So the whole book is really Cherry retelling her story. And again, all of the story is based on facts that I've learned as I was doing my genealogical research. This slide was incorporated because I wanted to share with you after I finished writing The Cedar Chest. Well, actually, I was still writing The Cedar Chest when I decided to do the audiobook as well. And so I asked my mother if she would be the voiceover talent. That's her in the center of the slide, Bernice Holmes. And then I found Ricky Porter, who was the audio director and producer. He recorded my mother in the studio. It took her about 8 months. He also laid the sound effects as well as the background music into the audio book. I have a version with the music and sound effects and one without it. I'll say that this was an exciting time for me because as the author, I would write the words, and I really believe I was kind of disembodied in some of that process because I would hear the sounds, I would hear my mother's voice, and it was as if I had never heard those words before. It moved me. So if you choose to do an audio book, know that I gave my mother grace and creative license to kind of change a little of the words. If she was feeling a certain thing, I didn't stop her as long as it didn't jump too far off of the storyline. But she did have room to express herself and her feelings during the recordings, as long as she kept, again, to that storyline. So if you choose to do an audio book, know that, that's something that you should consider. I mentioned about some of the things that you'll have to consider on the previous slide, but in addition to your voiceover talent and your audio director, other considerations is, how do you take the information in your novel and write it into a usable script for an audiobook? And then who will narrate? Will you have a narrator? And then, background music and sound effects. For me, it was important to have those sound effects because it was a perfect vehicle to transport us back in time, the listener. There were times where it would be a wagon wheel that would hit a dirt road. And that, to me, that sound effect would transfer us back in time. So know that those are some other additional considerations that you should think about when you're creating an audiobook. So on the next slide, I'd like to give you an opportunity to listen to just a snippet of The Cedar Chest, the audiobook. So let's go listen to that.
After the death of my grandmother, Mama called the family meeting at Medea's house. Once everyone arrived, she instructed me to go into the spare room and get an old quilt and its contents out of the cedar chest. I cleared the clutter on top of the cedar chest and opened it. The smell of the mothballs hit my nose. It was a suffocating smell, but I didn't let it deter me. I grabbed the quilt and brought it to Mama. She carefully unfolded it, revealing a box. Inside the box was a tape recorder and 12 cassette tapes. Each one was labeled by a number. Mama motioned for me to plug in the player. I did. She carefully pulled out cassette number 1, entitled Cherry's Interview, inserted it, and pushed the recorder's play button.
You know, I sure don't like talking about slavery. I tries my best to forget that dark part of my life. But even I want to tell it, I want to tell you about the world within the world a slave had. I can tell what it was like being a slave for 12 years, and I remembers it all. Before I tell my story, let me tell you how my story got to be collected. It was in the fall of 36, about 75 years after the break. You know the break from white folks, what I'm talking about. And them white students from the university came up here to the church house. And just as soon as Pastor got through with his sermon, they allowed to step up there in front of us. Said they wanted to collect all our slave stories so to have save it from time, and people later on might want to read about it and listen to it. Of course, I said to myself, I says, Cherry, you know them white folks ain't gonna want to listen to none of that stuff they did to us. It's mighty scandalous how they treated us black folks. You know them white folks, they ain't gonna want to know about that now.
Throughout the course of this presentation, we have discussed what type of artifacts to collect in order to write your family histories. We've talked about tips on writing and creating family history books, as well as nonfiction novels, and then converting that into an audio book. But let's talk about the impact of having family history. We know that it is a sense of belonging or gives us an identity when we connect to our roots. There is this continuity linking the past to our present times, and of course, showing the resiliency of our ancestors. We are here because they survived. It also gives us an opportunity to look at our culture from whence we came, and that gives us a sense of these lessons and these historical events that happened. It adds to our cultural knowledge and awareness. And then the emotional bonds that are created because of that information. I have met with a lot of family members after having created our family history books. Those bonds are now our strong bonds now. And then, of course, the legacy, preserving the history of our ancestors for future generations to come. Those are some of the impacts of having a family history. Here's another family member that is in my family history book. This is my great grandmother's sister Hattie during Jim Crow. She left the South, went up to Chicago to find a better living for her and her children. And, it was crowded in Chicago during that time period. And she helped in her way solve some of those issues for housing shortage. In the bottom right corner, this was a 3-story building that she rented out to, colored people, rooms in order for, them to have better housing, cleaner housing in Chicago. And so, if I had a family member that lived in a certain area, I'd talk a little bit about that area that they lived in. So again, this history book is American history, showing the sojourn of my family throughout American history. I've talked so much about Cherry throughout tonight's presentation that I feel obligated to show you the section in the family history book that talk about Cherry and the Chinook people. I have a whole chapter about her and her culture. Lewis and Clark encountered the Chinook people, and they had a lot to say about it, and that information I incorporated in this chapter as well. Here you see images of their artwork, and then in the bubble on the left side of the screen, it's my daughter. I just used her image to create this cartoon character of Cherry. So again, I just kind of wanted to share this page with you. This is an interesting story I wanted to share with you that I learned about my 3 times great grandfather, Washington Foote. I've mentioned him tonight multiple times. Well, to my surprise, 3 years after being emancipated in 1868, Washington Foote filed a claim against one of the richest white landowners in the county he lived in. He had 2 bales of cotton that had been taken from him. He stepped away from it, and it had been taken from him and sold to Barrett. And so he filed a claim with the Freedmen's Bureau about the cotton that had been stolen from him. He was only 21 years old when he did that. I traced it down. I didn't see too much resolution that happened to that claim, but he filed a second claim. That first claim is what's in the upper right-hand corner. I got something really special to share with you on the next slide. Let's go to that.
Ain't nobody tell me that Washington Foote ain't a blessed and highly favored man. I considers myself to be highly favored on account of the fact that I married a sweet little Indian girl named Cherry Golich, who blessed me with 8 chillins. I had just moved from the Foote's tobacco farm in Virginia to their cotton farm in Mississippi when I first laid my eyes on Cherry in March of 1861. She was 21 years old and I was 16. From that day forward, fate would always see that we would stay together. Even after the break, she chose to stay with me and I with her.
I started thinking about the history books and the novel and thought to myself, they are not kid friendly. And so my solution to being able to bring this past to the younger generation, I thought we got to create something that is, more acceptable for them. And in this case, I thought about the perfect matchup between like Build-A-Bear and the American Girl dolls and create my own line of dolls called the Malele Ancestral dolls. This is a representation of Cherry's doll. My niece played her, in the book at age 25. And so during her photo shoot, the clothes that she wore, we used that as, the guide to go by to create the clothes for Cherry's doll. Because I want these to be heirloom dolls, the voice box is typically in the stomach. I didn't do that. We have voice boxes that, I mean, I can, and a couple of the dolls are that way, but I really don't want them to be touched a lot. So um, there's a voice box inside of the quilt in the cedar chest for Cherry, and other dolls that I'll show you in a moment. Their doll boxes, I mean, their voice boxes could be a QR code or, a similar prop. So let's go take a look at those. Here's some examples of three other dolls that I made. They're all patterned after my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and last, my mother. My great-grandmother is our family's version of Rosie the Riveter. My aunt, during the interview, she told me that my great-grandmother would come home after working at the arsenal and say, "I dodged a bomb today." I never knew. They never shared the story that she worked at the arsenal. That's a prime example of self-erasure. Those little tidbits of facts that are being lost in time because they're not being told to the next generation. And then my grandmother's doll has a plaid dress on just like her and the exact same sweater. The dress is just red and where my grandmother's is blue. And then my mom, who is a living elder, she was the family's first nurse. And so her doll is adorning a nurse's uniform to match the picture that my mom had. So all of these dolls will have their own doll case. In the back, you see the Rosie the Riveter black woman in the background. And if I can find, photographs that could give a better setting, like their old house, whatever the case may be that we want to share about them, we can put that in the back of the dollhouse. Again, these dolls are the Malele Ancestral dolls, and we'll be doing a soft launch next spring. While I was writing my book, my middle daughter, she decided to write a children's book. She wanted something that was more kid-friendly for the younger generation. And so she took facts from our family history book and created this storyline of two teenage time travelers that would go back in time and meet family members. So the Gullidge, the People, the Kellys, the Scarboroughs, and the Foots, these teenage time travelers would be meeting them. Once she finished that book, she did a more broader subject matter that, is not specific to my family, but it was entitled Why Us? Explaining Slavery to an African American Child. I'd like to offer you a few tips on getting started. One, before beginning your interviewing, have a list of family members that you're going to go interview. Have a set of curated questions that you're going to ask, because there may be information that your elders will share that might not be related to information that you want to gather. Be patient with them because you may have been one of few relatives that came to visit them. And so it may veer off a little off course. Catalog all of the information by matriarchs and patriarchs. Keep it separate. I can't tell you how many Marys were in my family. So, it's a way of making sure that you don't mix a namesake up. And then have backup storage for, the information that you're collecting, all of those artifacts and additional documents that they may offer you. I found it important to journal while I was writing, just, to keep myself balanced. There's a lot of information that was sensitive to me, and so journaling and meditating was a way that I didn't, have burnout. And then last, I'd say have a filing folder system, a physical one, with a storage bin, just to keep those records and artifacts, preserved and protected. Now, these are just a few of the tips that I'm offering. I also have a set of books called Rediscovering Your Roots. It has more tips in those books, as well as information about different platforms that you can use in your genealogical journey, to extract and find information about the family. Before opening it up for Q&A, I wanted to have this social media page so you could take your phone and scan the QR codes that are present on the screen. I also wanted to leave my telephone number. I want to stay connected. So, scan it, come over to my social media platforms, see what we're discussing about genealogy and storytelling and some of the other items that I spoke about during this presentation. I'm here to ask questions. And then now let's just open it up for Q&A. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak here tonight.